I'm talking about Hölderlin, who for me is a greater poet than Goethe, who was better at Greek than Goethe, and better than at Greek as a translator than Nietzsche. Although Nietzsche, let us not forget, was made a full professor at the age of 24 at the University of Basel in Switzerland, where Burckhardt was, and I'm sure other good classicists. Hölderlin had been the tutor in a house in France inhabited by a German family, and unfortunately may have fallen in love with the lady of the house, mother of the children he was educating, tutoring, and I think her husband was pretty much like the husband in Goethe's Leiden, or the Sorrows of Werther by Goethe, and also like the piece that Torquato Tasso, that Goethe, the play he wrote about a very brilliant young man who was in love with his landlady, whose husband was a man of action, in total contrast to the suffering poet, who then the whole thing turns to tragedy after he falls in love with the lady of the house. Hölderlin had to leave this household because of depression. He returned to Tübingen, where his very religious mother was, who sort of reminds me of my grandmother and her sexual prudery and a person uptight about the erotic facts of life. His mother wanted him to be, he was in the same class with Georg Hegel in a seminary, and was on his way to becoming a Protestant minister. Hölderlin was, but he retired to his house on the river, which is a gorgeous place I visited with my wife, Pat. And there he continued to write his great poems, a poem about the seasons, and which I saw the manuscripts of in his tower where he did his writing. He played the piano about 5 hours a day, and was manic, and wrote the great poems, Patmos, Bread and Wine, and the poem called The Middle of Life. A person is walking down a street. He stares at a moss-covered wall, which he describes as speechless. In other words, this blank wall, a stone wall, doesn't talk. So he's looking at it, but it does not look back at him. It doesn't obviously have eyes or a mouth to speak with, and he calls it sprachlos, speechless. And he hears the kind of clattering of the on the roof of that house, with the wall of the wainscot, which tells the direction in the wind. And this is what one hears and sees in the middle of life, let's say at the age of 48. And it's a very sad poem, beautiful poem, beautiful, beautiful poem. It's called Das Heft des Lebens, and then he wrote Bread and Wine and Homecoming and Patmos, in which there is a line talking about Jesus. He said, "Sein Licht war Tod," his light was death. Now, let us interpret that. How could Jesus' illuminating vision be death? And why would this be something that's positive, such as the light that lights the world, in which St. John talks about when he describes Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, was the Logos, in his gospel. How do we interpret his light was death? Well, let's say light in the terms of hope is we have to die to be forgiven. So his illuminating, his vision of showing us the light for our future is when we can die and come to the kingdom of heaven. It's all about the coming of the kingdom. Why is it something that is full of light, and which is a hopeful image? It's because we are forgiven for our sins. There is no tragedy in the Christian doctrine, especially if you're a Roman Catholic or something of that ilk. Because no matter what you do, the Lord has promised to forgive you. And this is the greatest hope that is offered to humanity. This is the truly Pauline spin that's put on Christian doctrine. This is the overlay of St. Paul, Paul of Tarsus, who had the Greek education, wrote the greatest rhetoric in Corinthians and the letters to Romans, all the early Christian churches. Shaming some of them, saying you don't want to be like slaves. Free your minds. Keep your minds free. Nothing is going to take away the freedom of your thought. There must be free thought. It sounds a little bit like, Paul sounds a little bit like Thomas Jefferson. So that's my interpretation of Sein Licht war Tod. And that's in the revised version of Patmos. His Patmos is one of the great poems of all time, in my opinion. And I mean, to me, greater than any poem Goethe wrote, with the kind of range that, let's say, the second part of Faust had. And a great poetic gift, his ability to write Alsaic poetry and actually translate the hard metrics of Pindaric odes. He's maybe the greatest translator in the German language. Of course, we get it all in translation, and it's nothing like the original. My great friend Darrell Hine had this gift of translating from the Greek, the Homeric hymns, Ovid's epistles, of which I have a copy of in a letter he sent me. He is probably the greatest translator into English of Latin and Greek, and a great lyric poet also. He wrote his In and Out poem. He wrote Polish subtitles about being traveling in Poland and a kind of travelogue, and he also wrote a novel about Robert Graves called The Devil's Disciple, and he wrote a book called The Devil's Picture Book, a book of poems, and we had a poem of his in one of our issues of our magazine, Canto, called, it was a very, very brilliant, virtuoso, technically, and forget the name of that one. He wrote a beautiful poem about Eros and Persephone, about the god of love, the male god of love, Adonis, stealing in to take a peek at his lover. And he has a candle, he's trying to get a look at her face, but a drop of candle wax falls on her and she wakes painfully with a start, and he's discovered. This takes place, this poem is in The Golden Ass by Apuleius, about Lucian being turned into, it's about transformation, very much in the Ovid tradition of transformations and metamorphosis, Ovid's metamorphosis. And but Darrell does a version, his own version of that story, not at all like the Apuleius. These are the moments in great poetry when it is so important that the poets we're talking about have been well schooled in the classics and can translate brilliantly with technical perfection, with the metric, with the prosody necessary, and the gift for rhyme and meter of somebody like Darrell Hine. Coleridge, many of the English greats had this, were very brilliant in their Greek, and that was sort of their pedigree to become great poets. Coleridge, definitely. Swinburne had that gift. I don't know about Keats and Byron. I don't know how Byron got to be so powerful in his career, writing things like Childe Harold in Italy and other long poems. I'm not so interested in his lyrics as I am Keats, Wordsworth, or Coleridge, or people like the metaphysicals, Vaughan, Donne, Herbert, Traherne, even Ben Jonson. I could go on and on about this subject because unfortunately, the people who have to listen to me all the time, I know too much. And it's like being a teller at a bank with a large account of knowledge and writing certified checks on this bank account, this huge account full of knowledge and anecdotes and stories. I'm a raconteur. Nicholas says I have racked up 8.5 hours of this. I hope it's not gibberish. Surely any international listeners or viewers need to be warned that they may not understand my speech. I have had 9 strokes I did not have aphasia. However, I tend to run on, and I can be very boring, and it would take extraordinary patience, and we hope I'm audible enough I mean, my handwriting is no longer legible the way it used to be, quite perfect, my cursive, but my speech is sometimes slurred and not as well enunciated as it could be or should be. Anyway, it's a new day here, Monday. All the stores are closed here in the lower Normandy, except in Pont-l'Évêque and maybe Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive. Nicholas! Nicholas! Nick! Nick! Nicholas! I'm finished. You can turn the volume down on that music just a little bit.